I talked to a couple down in Florida just the other day. The wife is a Democrat. The husband is a Republican. They both voted for Donald Trump. They put $300,000 worth of their own hard-earned money into improvement programs in their farm with a promise from the FSA that that would be reimbursed. And they were told 2 weeks ago, you're not going to get that money.
Hello, one and all, and welcome back to a new, very special episode of The Rural Impact. I am Michelle Rathman, and I am grateful to all of our return listeners. And if you're new, welcome. We are very glad that you could join us for another conversation that works to connect the dots between policy and rural everything. Now, today is, again, very special. It is number one, our 60th episode of this podcast. So we're very excited about that. And I have a slate of guests that I think you're going to really appreciate hearing from. But before we get started, I do want to talk just a moment about the events of this past weekend. I am recording on Tuesday, June 17th, 2025. And as you are very likely aware, over the weekend, we had a very tragic event with the killing of a Minnesota state Democratic lawmaker. That's my home state, and her husband, as well as the attempted murder of another and his family. And of course, this is just a few days after organizers of the nationwide No King's Day protest in response to President Donald Trump's policies. Millions of people took to the streets in, I guess, 2,100 towns is what I'm reading, in cities across America, including in rural places. Now, both of these events over the weekend, one, as we can all agree, gut-wrenching and tragic, and the other very telling of the times that we are in. They underscore the point that we make here on the Rural Impact every episode, every opportunity we have, and that is every road to the quality of our collective lives, they are paved by policy and shaped by those who are elected to office, many of whom today are making decisions that seek to divide us, also defunding key rural lifeline programs, while also wreaking havoc, serious havoc on rural serving nonprofits and institutions, threatening the loss of access to healthcare for millions, while putting rural and other safety net hospital systems at risk as a result of the House-passed bill, which, as we know, as of today anyway, and of course news is happening fast, is sitting with the Senate and they're doing their markup. Either way, that initial budget looked to slash gross Medicaid and CHIP spending by almost $864 billion over the next 10 years. And we absolutely know this will be devastating for rural populations across this country. And, I just want to say this, and it's important, again, we have courageous conversations here. So here we go. All of the things that we're talking about, the policies that we're talking about that you'll hear us address today, they do not spare so-called red states. And I do truly wish that in some point in my lifetime, we are no longer talking about red states and blue states, but here we are. And so I believe there's no more urgent time for all of us to engage in these candid, courageous, and most of all, civil conversations. We could do that about how all of these policies, from immigration, as well as to the illegal withholding of congressionally appropriated funds, from deep cuts to Medicaid, which we'll talk about, to eliminating the Department of Education, and what all of these, the implications for rural as a result. So again, just want to remind everybody, the things that we're talking about today, if you haven't read it, we're very clearly spelled out in the blueprint. That is Project 2025. So if you're interested, you might want to flip that open and track the policies of today to that which is outlined in that particular document. All right, so we're going to move forward. Now, let me tell you about today's episode. A few months ago, I was contacted by the Democratic National Committee, that is the DNC, and the question was, would we be interested in hosting a roundtable to have a discussion with the members of the party's People's Cabinet? Now, if you've been following my work, you know that I welcome, and I mean it, any opportunity to hear directly from those on the front lines of policy, the strategists, the sausage makers, as they're called, contributing to our nationwide conversation on rural opportunities. And on the flip side of that, our growing disparity gap. So In short, it took me all of about 2 seconds to say yes to facilitating this conversation. And of course, this was many weeks before the middle of the night passage of the House budget. And as I said at the top of the show, prior to this weekend's tragic events in Minnesota. So at the end of the day, I do believe it's important for us to continue having these conversations. And to do that, I'm excited to share with you our panelists, and they include the president of the Association of State Democratic Committees, that's Jane Kleeb out of Nebraska, co-chair of Dirt Dems, that's Chris Jones, rural policy expert Will Westmoreland, and Midwestern regional chair and chair of the Missouri Democratic Party, Russ Carnahan. Now, together, the five of us, we cover a lot of territory on a wide range of subjects, including insights focused on the shifts in the Democratic Party and how they intend to re-engage with rural voters. And I was really glad that we were able to take the conversation in that direction as well. So with all that said, it is at that time where I invite you to tune out that background noise, and we know there's plenty of it, and listen to my conversation with Jane Kleeb, Chris Jones, Russ Carnahan, and Mr. Will Westmoreland. With that, I am so ready. I am glad you're here. So let's just jump right in and go. Welcome to the Rural Impact Roundtable for what promises to be one heck of a candid conversation. I am sure of that. Russ Carnahan, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Jane Fleming Kleeb, also great to have you with us.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Wonderful. And Chris Jones, welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
And Will Westmoreland, as they say, this entire panel is a great panel, but they save the best for last. Will, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Michelle. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. Okay, we have so much to talk about. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Russ, I am going to start with you. As I share, we did put out to our listeners, we asked people to send us some of their questions. And this is one that I have to get us started off, is the fact that, we do want to get into policies, but we know that there needs to be a plan for rural engagement. There's no one who can argue with that one, I don't think, because despite the reports of some eroding support for Donald Trump's policies in rural America, the fact remains that 63% of rural voters, up from 60% in 2020, went to Trump. And so, as I said, we put the question out to listeners, and this one came in, which is really this: given the growing rural-urban divide, what new messages or strategies are Democrats exploring to engage rural voters without sounding condescending or in touch? How are we going to engage rural folks out there and having conversations that are focused on policy and the impact that it's having on their quality of life?
Yeah, I love this question to kick this off. And, I grew up in rural South Missouri. I represented an urban district in the state legislature and then a congressional district that was part urban and part rural. So I sort of have had a foot in both rural and urban Missouri and politics. And I think the key to me is you don't look at them separately. To me, the art of politics is building a bridge between the two and finding that common ground. Certainly, there are unique issues in urban America and rural America, but there's a whole bunch of common ground issues that bring folks together. And I think too often when we look at them separately, we do a disservice also, just in terms of sheer political organizing. Areas in urban areas that tend to be stronger Democratic areas to be able to adopt and engage some of those rural communities to help their leaders and their communities with resources and ideas, so they feel like they're part of that. And really the first rung on the ladder in a lot of rural America and rural Missouri for Democrats is frankly just showing up. Many of our small counties, don't have any few or no Democratic elected officials. Their Democratic committee and clubs are, inactive or don't exist, and they're listening to news sources that are not accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So again, just showing up and that art of finding those bridge issues is really key. The one quick example I'll give, when I was in the legislature, we were having a hard time getting rural legislators to vote for transitioning urban bus systems to biodiesel fuel until they figured out they needed X thousand more acres of soybeans to be planted to fill that demand. And all of a sudden they saw, well, maybe that's not such a bad idea. But that, to me, was just a classic example of finding that common ground issue between urban and rural areas.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a real good point before we move on to you, Jane, because, my notes here, we show that in 2022, Democrats left 51% of partisan down ballot races uncontested. And I think that's another really big point, because if we're not at the table, what do they say? If you are not on the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah.
I think is the phrase. So thank you for that, Russ. Jane, I want to turn to you. But first of all, just congratulations on your recent elections to be in the positions that you're in now, serving as president of the Association of State Democratic Committees and 2025 DNC vice chair. Where, again, thank you for your time. You got a lot on your plate, I would imagine. But you said, Jane, and I went in my research, you said, and I really love the way you stated this. For rural people, most everything is tied to the land, livelihoods, family histories, hopes, and aspirations. And we also know that America's food supply, for example, as well as for many parts of the world up until recently, really relied on American agriculture and our land to grow our food. So these are tied, whether we want to talk about it or not, we do, to climate impacts and environment. So given that, we'll just put it out there, 70% of the Project 2025 plans for the environment have already either been accomplished or are right in the works. And that includes rescinding USAID policies that address climate change, that help countries transition away from fossil fuels, abolishing the Office of Domestic Climate Policy through an executive order, and now in progress, something that's on a lot of people's minds, which is breaking up of NOAA, making it private, and abolishing the climate work that they're doing. So let's just talk a little bit about that. I don't think anyone in rural America can dismiss how significant this will be, especially as we go into hurricane season. So, Jane, with all that, what are just a few of the imperatives that you think our listeners need to know about how these actions and these policies, including the cuts, the grants, staffing, and so forth, what's it going to do to our land, the air we breathe, the water, our disaster preparedness? That's a mouthful.
Yeah, no question. I mean, we could have 3-hour conversation just on that one question alone.
Mm-hmm.
Let me try to be a little bit brief and touch on a few points. One, any farmer or rancher, the app that they're looking at every morning is the weather app on their phone, or tuning into their local television to see what the news anchor is going to say about the weather. And a lot of local weather folks have been saying recently that they are unprepared to make credible forecasts given all of the cuts that Trump and the Republicans have done to the data and science that they need access to. So this is a major issue. It obviously impacts planting and all sorts of things that we do to grow enough food to not only feed America, but feed the world. And that's something that rural America, whether you're in a very heavy ag state like Nebraska, Arkansas, Missouri, there's other states that aren't known for ag like New York, but are also growing a tremendous amount of food to feed Americans and feed the world. The other side of that coin is our land is also and has the ability to power America and power the world. And these cuts that they are doing, in particular to wind and solar, because they are leaning into this misinformation, mostly fueled by fossil fuel corporations who don't want more diversified energy base because that means less money in their pockets, is really doing damage to a lot of our rural communities where folks who have limited access to information and news sources are believing what Donald Trump says when he says that wind is causing cancer or wind is, taking ag land out of production, when in fact, the majority of ag land in Nebraska, for example, when about 75% of the corn we grow is going to energy. It is going to biofuels, which I fully support and a lot of the Democratic Party support. So we have to start talking to rural folks about how big corporations and the Republican Party are constantly wanting to damage to their land, air, and water. Also, they can line their pocketbooks rather than what rural America wants to do. We have a lot of pride and dignity in the hard work that it takes to grow energy and grow food and grow fiber. And Democrats, quite honestly, have not been talking about that at the national stage, on the pundits, on these TV stations. That's why I think it's important for folks like myself, for Russ, for Chris. We are now rising in the ranks, if you will, of leadership among the Democratic Party, where they have more rural voices who are able to speak to these issues.
Thank you. I think it's so important because on this podcast, we work to connect all these dots. And then we also take a look at how many states are missing billions of dollars of canceled disaster funds. And, this hits farmers, ranchers very, very hard when that money isn't there for them. So thank you for that. We're going to circle back on some other climate issues. Chris, I want to move to you because you've got a really unique story, and we're going to make sure everyone knows all of your backgrounds on our website. But the topic I want to turn to briefly is one that comes up, questions I have received for this particular episode, and one that's coming up all over the place is DEI. And I'm going to say, I said, someone's going to have to rip the word equity out of my dead cold body because we can't make it illegal to say because it's something that's so necessary. And as the co-chair of Dirt Road Dems in one of America's reddest states, you've been vocal about the need to break the cycle of exclusion, including the need to create inclusive, equitable systems that empower every voice and every vote. So since taking office again, Donald Trump has eradicated both public and private diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. That's no secret to anyone. And there truly is an assault on DEI initiatives, and it's been described as a case study in actions that virtually guarantee rural people and places they live will be disproportionately wounded. So let's go there. My question is, what has or will be the impact on eliminating equity initiatives in rural communities across Arkansas and the U.S.?
Well, look, great question, great framing, and critically important. I think the impact is going to be massive. It's actually hard to measure the impact of some of these decisions because the changes and shifts. And look, the reality is equity isn't a buzzword. It's a lifeline in rural America. As you said, I'm in Arkansas. I'm born and raised here. My family's over 200 years in this state. And I know what it's like to live in rural areas, eating honeysuckle and riding dirt bikes, and to represent these areas. And a lot of times in our rural areas, these are not only rural, but underserved. So, you go across the Delta, and equity for folks that live in the Delta is the difference between a kid getting internet that they can actually rely on to do their homework and to learn and falling behind in school. Mm-hmm. It's the difference between a farmer getting access to mental health care versus suffering in silence. It's prenatal care. When a mom has to drive 90, 150 miles because there are no rural hospitals, because the hospitals are closing. So equity is about changing that landscape and changing that dynamic. And when Donald Trump and the GOP, and let me tell you, Sarah Sanders here in Arkansas has been a leader in dismantling equity initiatives. And we're seeing that they're waging a culture wars is really cutting off the oxygen supply in rural communities. Mm-hmm. It's Medicaid cuts where, nearly half the kids in Arkansas rely on Medicaid. It's Head Start, or kids are trying to learn at an early age to set themselves up for success and to get out of poverty. It's food assistance through SNAP. Mm-hmm. That's not some abstract thing. Equity is making sure that every child can go to bed with a full stomach, knowing that they'll wake up the next morning ready to attack the world and the challenges we face. Mm-hmm. So, I think we don't know the impact, but what we do know is that the impact will be massive. And last thing I'll say is these attacks on equity, it's deliberate, it's strategic, and it's intended to actually leave people behind. I'm an ordained minister, and the Bible says a house divided cannot stand. It's intended to divide the house and leave rural folks behind. And the very folks who want to support the GOP, who want to support Trump, are being mistreated misused and attacked by them because of these sorts of initiatives and things.
Yeah, and I think to your point, we might not be able to even calculate the damage that will come, but we know what it was before we had a focus on equity. When I go, back to not having opportunities for Black farmers, for example, and not having opportunities for women in agriculture and so forth. And so it really is going back in time. So thank you for that, Chris. Will, I'm going to turn to you because you are the farmer on the panel, which we always need to have. Your story is quite remarkable as well. I read that you raised your children by yourself, as my father did with me as well. So that's something that we have in common. But you work to support America's farmers and ranchers, and you encourage, and I'm going to encourage our listeners, as I said, to learn more about you. But you have an emphasis on rural politics and farming. So let's talk a little bit about the economic agenda, the big, beautiful bill, as it's called, and you've talked about it on your back 40 about the numbers. You said you did some running of the numbers. So what will cutting $7 billion from agriculture funding for fiscal 26 mean for America's farmers and ranchers, their communities, and for that matter, all of America, while we're looking at numbers at adding $3 trillion to the deficit over a period of time? I think the numbers are just so confusing to people. I think you can help us break it down a little bit.
Yeah, and you make a great point. I think the key to this is what we need to understand is that rural America is fighting for lack of a better term, they're fighting a two-front war against the Trump administration right now. And I want to describe it this way. So I go all over the country and I speak to rural people, Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And I can tell you the good news is there's a realization coming home now that these policies are not good for rural America. Now, in all cases, they haven't gone as far as realizing what the source of the angst is. But Jane and Russ and Chris and I, we're going to do everything we can to help them get there. But this two-front war, I'd break it down into two different things. First of all, there's a realization that what's happening in rural America with funding and these assaults that are occurring are a direct result of the administration's efforts to give a $3 to $4 trillion tax break to billionaires. And that's something we haven't seen in the past, is the direct connection that people in rural America are making there. So they're getting it that, hey, this isn't right. We're out here working sweat of our brow, earning this GDP for our rural communities, and they're getting all the breaks. In terms of the numbers, what's really bad about this, let's start on the economic side. Even though farmers and ranchers only make up 14% of the rural population, they produce in one way or another through companies that support them or purchases they make in retail, et cetera. They support over 60% of the GDP in rural America. So when you talk about these assaults on farmers, I talked to a couple down in Florida just the other day. The wife is a Democrat. The husband is a Republican. They both voted for Donald Trump. They put $300,000 worth of their own hard-earned money into improvement programs in their farm with a promise from the FSA that would be reimbursed. And they were told 2 weeks ago, you're not going to get that money. So even that was politicized. We saw the farmers and ranchers that screamed the loudest on social media get their checks to quiet them down. But we've got thousands of farmers out there that still haven't gotten that money, and they're not going to get it. The other side of that assault, so, that has a direct impact on economics because farmers now have to make up for that with their own cash reserves. That's going to lead to less money they can spend locally in their communities, et cetera. So that's the first part of the attack. The second part of the attack is a lot of these programs that they're cutting, and Chris can speak to this especially, are programs that we use in rural America. So in our 400 largest agricultural counties in this country, we're seeing a population shift where young people are moving away and the average age is climbing. And that's because of schools that don't measure up, economic situations that don't measure up. And all this is doing is making that worse. We use more SNAP in rural America than we do in urban areas. We're cutting that by half, which means people have to move away to get better jobs in order to support their families because they don't get that assistance at the local level. And finally, I would just say, you don't have to take our word for it, right? You don't have to believe Jane or Russ or Chris or me. If you look at the bankruptcies that are occurring already at the beginning of this Trump administration among farmers, they're up by 200%. We've had a doubling of the number of bankruptcies. And unfortunately, we always know what comes right after that. And that's suicides and mental health issues and poor health. So this is a two-front assault. And the bottom line is we've got to engage with rural America to get them to step up to help us push back against this. So that's why I'm so excited about the work that the DNC is committed to do, what Jane's already doing, Russ is already doing, and Chris is already doing.
Mm-hmm. Facts matter. They really, really matter. And then on the heels of that, we take a look at the programs that are designed to help with mental health issues with farmers, and those programs are being cut to nothing as well. All right. So, Will, thank you for that. Now we're going to get started and go around the table here because there's a lot of things for us to talk about with a focus again on connecting the dots between policy and rural quality of life, opportunities, prosperity, and on the flip side of that, disparity. And as I'm looking at all my morning reading, I see the disparity gaps growing wider and wider and wider. And I'm quite concerned. People who listen to this podcast know my day job is in rural health. And so we fear many, many more hospital closures, for example. But we've been having a lot of conversation on this podcast about Medicaid cuts. Go around the table and say, there's a promise not to touch it and so forth, but the numbers do not lie. So right now in the House's version of the big, beautiful bill, the Congressional Budget Office estimates the bill's Medicaid and CHIP provisions would cut gross Medicaid and CHIP spending by $863.4 billion over the next 10 years. And that does not include other provisions impacting the ACA and how that will impact states as they work to institute onerous work requirements, restrictions on states' ability to finance Medicaid through increased provider taxes, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think it would be very hard pressed to not believe, again, you don't have to believe me for 1 minute, that rural health is at a state right now where we could see a collapse that we've never experienced before, and we certainly don't want to. So I'd like to just kind of go around the table. The question to each of you is, how one of our listeners said, how are the Democrats going to prepare for the worst case scenario at the state level and now push back at these cuts and also helping real voters understand the real pain these policies will cause and what it's connected to. So I open it up. Whoever wants to go first, the floor is yours.
Well, I'll take a stab at this and vent a little bit. Mm-hmm. The Republicans doubling down on failed economic policies. Their trickle down economic theory is the largest transfer of wealth in American history if this passes. And so Republicans have a failed economic policy that Trump and his folks have been, frankly, great marketers of disinformation about it. Democrats have a strong, powerful record of historic investments in infrastructure and services, especially in rural America. But frankly, we haven't done the job we need to do to communicate that. So part of that's on us calling it out and showing the real life impacts to folks. And people are seeing that. They're beginning to see that. We've got to keep up that pressure. We've seen some Republicans hesitating or, conditioning support on certain things. So we're beginning to see some breaks there. They can read the polls. They can see how this is unpopular. You've seen the break between Trump and Elon Musk. You've seen, amazing turnouts at Democratic town halls. So there's a lot going on out there for people to wake up. And in these special elections, we've seen Democrats running, well ahead of anything they would have in a normal election. And so, all this lead up to the midterms, where I think there'll be a big turn back to Democrats, but we've got to do the work now to be ready and continue to get that message out.
Chris, I think about you and your state and the implications at the state level. I mean, really helping people understand what this means. It is a shift of massive burdens of cost to the states. What would that look like in Arkansas?
So it's layered, and I'll start by saying, we have 25 rural hospitals that are at risk of closing, and about half of those are at severe risk of immediate closing. Mm-hmm. Now that's in the context of, you talk about the burden being pushed to the state. Well, Arkansas has a trigger law.
Right.
So once the federal support goes below a certain threshold, Medicaid is done in Arkansas. And now you layer that on top of the fact that, because the reality is, Donald Trump is the president, but he's not the initiator of this foolishness. He is continuing the foolishness. But again, we have Sarah Sanders here in Arkansas, and she purged in 23. She purged almost 500,000 Arkansans from Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
And of that, almost 100,000 children lost Medicaid coverage, meaning 100,000 children, like almost 20% of our state's children, had medical coverage, could go see a doctor, could go get dental care, could go get their non-emergent issues taken care of, and now they can't. And in my household, it's pretty personal. My wife is an emergency medicine physician, so she sees,
yes,
she understands the medical field and that whole ecosystem, but she also sees the impact of people not having primary care physicians, people not being able to go regularly see a doctor. They show up in her ER when, guess what? If you're showing up in the ER and using the ER as your primary care physician, it's going to cost you
the highest cost for healthcare.
It's the highest cost.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole notion of efficiency and saving money is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing is we're putting people's health at risk. And for those who can afford it, it doesn't change their life.
Mm-hmm.
For the billionaires and the oligarchs, it doesn't change their life. For the rest of us who struggle and are trying to make ends meet, for the farmer who has to pay for massive equipment and still try to put food on the table, what it means is you could not have coverage. And so there could come a time when there's an empty seat at your dinner table. And the empty seat is at the dinner table is not because of something that was not preventable. It's totally preventable. That's what bothers me. We're literally reshaping, they are literally reshaping the trajectory of families by these decisions.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because some of the messaging, as you've all mentioned earlier, is that there is a belief out there, and sometimes I can't actually believe it, but we have to be better at saying, listen, the notion that people are getting checks in their mailbox from Medicaid doesn't happen that way. Mm-hmm. And so the notion that the initiatives that they are putting forth to stop illegal immigrants from getting medical care, again, these are all kind of those look over here kind of subject matters. Yeah. And so I think it's important for us to talk about how do we speak to rural voters and say, you might be hearing this, and we're going to talk about misinformation at the end of this podcast. But so I really do appreciate you bringing that up. Let's switch over to education. Again, we've done a lot of coverage on rural education, some really innovative programs for post-secondary education and so forth. And what we're looking at right now, obviously, is the total dismantling of the Department of Education. And this is something I read this morning. The Trump administration is working at breakneck speed to wind down. I had to think about that. The U.S. Department of Education, and the proposed budget proposal for fiscal year 26 calls for 15% funding cuts to the department and a handful of changes to K through 12 higher education. And then it also includes taking $350 billion out of the higher education access and affordability, which we absolutely know is going to impact rural. So, right. Jane, Will, if I can hear from you, how will these cuts, first of all, how is it going to affect America's ability to be competitive for jobs? We talk about the brain drain all the time. And what are some of the more devastating impacts that you can see short and long term as a result of just basically gutting all of public education for all grade levels and post-secondary as well?
Yeah. Our middle child has an IEP, and she has since she was 2. We live in a small town, Hastings, and she was facing speech difficulty at the age of 2. Her daycare identified that with us and her doctor, and the public school system then created an IEP long before Maya was even eligible, obviously, to go to pre-K, which we only had limited pre-K because of limited funds for public schools. And, this is one of those areas where I really believe that as the Democratic Party, and we're talking about this internally to roll this type of more positive offense policy positions rather than, our 300-page policy platform that nobody's reading. And specifically for education, it would be about expanding public education to include pre-K for all of our kiddos and 2 years of community college. So no longer would a kid's education experience be kindergarten through high school. It would be pre-K through community college. That obviously would put money directly in middle and working class families' pockets of at least 2 years of daycare, which is increasingly expensive, about $12,000 a year on average for most families. And it would give a lot of young people, since only about 25% of our kids go to a 4-year college, it would give a lot of young people a real open ability to explore different trades or explore clean energy or cosmetology or nursing. So there's just so many opportunities that a community college could give a young person, and then have them be able to stay in their small town, which all of us know and experience the brain drain that we all know happens in a lot of our rural communities, because young people can't stay on the family farm or can't stay in the rural community because the jobs simply are not there. Republicans have constantly attacked public education. The Department of Ed cuts now is the most recent thing, but over the past 20 years, they've been whittling away at public education in all of our states, where many of us have had to go to the ballot. We just did in Nebraska in 2024, and we won with 70% of the votes of saying, no, you can't give public dollars to religious or charter schools. That public dollars are for public schools only. And that's the type of strong leadership that we need to keep on communicating as the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and Will, in your neck of the woods, we've had on Just Paper in Missouri before, and we know that the voucher program is strong as that ever was. And so I wonder if you could opine a bit on what that's doing to your own, to the rural communities in your state, and how we can address that.
I got to be honest with you guys. I've got a real chip on my shoulder when it comes to this, because I was able to take advantage of an incredible rural school system when I was young. And I just believe, if you guys don't mind, I want to tell a personal story, because I think the facts and figures tell one story, but I think the key to winning over rural America is telling personal stories. Mm-hmm. When I was in high school, I played football, but I was never going to be a football player in college at 5'11", 205 pounds. Okay. But also, growing up with two sisters, I was a pretty damn good debater. I learned it at an early age from growing up in a household with 3 women. Okay. I had to learn how to hold my own. And it was pretty self-evident in my freshman year of high school that I was going to be good at this. I went to my first debate tournament with a pair of my brother's corduroy pants on with duct tape holding up the hem. I had my grandpa's dress shirt on with a tie from the 1970s and a pair of hush puppy shoes on. Well, when word got back to my little rural town, Bolivar, Missouri, that I'd almost won this tournament as a freshman, my mom got a call on Monday morning after the weekend with the tournament from the Red Hat Society in my little town. And they said, send Will down to the local clothing store, and we're going to meet him there, and we're going to buy him 2 suits that he can wear to go do these debates. And the reason for that, and they told us this when we went down there, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing your school, you're representing your community. I got to go to the nationals in debate 3 years in a row in high school, and nothing made my little school flew me to these places. They put us up in a hotel. Nothing made me prouder than to walk up to that board when somebody would write Bronx High School of Science or Downers Grove Private School or California International Merit Society. And I'd walk up there and write Bolivar, Missouri. And everybody would look at each other like, who's this upstart? If we lose these programs and this funding, it's going to take those opportunities away from kids all over rural America. And it's not just about the numbers. That's wrong. That is absolutely 100% wrong, because they're pitting us against each other. Why should we have to choose between whether or not kids in urban and rural America get a damn good education regardless of where they're going? And that's what this administration is all about, pitting one group against another group. And education in rural America is a perfect example of that.
Well said.
Michelle, can I say something there?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Just real quick, because Will and Jane, you're spot on. And education matters a lot to me, and I'm seeing the dismantling of it here in Arkansas with the voucher program. So just real quick, I think two things are happening. One, even though there are cuts to the federal Department of Education budget, I think the real culprit is the privatization. It's the privatization of education. It's the privatization of healthcare. It's the privatization of the prison system. It's privatization to funnel money and resources to a select few. And then I think the other real culprit is there are a certain number of people who want to be able to decide that I don't want to be in community with folks that are different from me. And when you combine those two, what you end up with is not a school system like Will grew up in or like I grew up in. People know me as the rocket scientist. There would be no Chris Jones, the rocket scientist, if not for federal dollars to help fund my college and my grad school through the Department of Education and NASA. So they take a little kid from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and help him funnel through the system to become a rocket scientist. That's what we would lose out on as we dismantle the Department of Education.
Such a disservice to our young people. I appreciate all of you, all of your thoughts on this. I mean, the other thing, it's really tied to this. We talked about food assistance programs and so forth. Rural children and rural families rely heavily. And sometimes I think that sounds like, well, I mean, maybe that does rub people the wrong way. We didn't create that. I mean, us sitting in this call, I mean, this is what it is. And so to just take away this funding from school nutrition programs, for example, I mean, so we know the numbers, proposed $300 billion in cuts to food assistance, very disproportionate to rural. You mentioned something earlier about privatization. Let's talk a little bit about, because I know this is a very big issue for so many rural communities, as it should be, which is the proposed privatization of the United States Post Office. So any of you care to talk about what the implications are, for commerce, for just daily life for people in rural? How are they going to get their prescriptions, things like that? What are you hearing from your constituents, from those that you're talking to about such a proposal?
I mean, it's such a center of our culture, our commerce, our communities as a resource that, the post office was designed to, be present in every community. And, ideas to cut that back, to not reach everywhere, what that means to those communities is devastating. And then attempts to privatize it, take it over again, without the mission to be everywhere, that doesn't work. And so we've got to fight that. And I think people, especially in those communities, will be standing up with us to do that.
I think that if it wasn't for FDR, we would not have electricity in rural communities, right? Like that's just the reality, because it was going to be too expensive to serve too few people for the corporations that were electrifying the big cities in America at the time. And it took the government and FDR in order to actually make sure that we had electricity in our rural communities so we could continue to grow and be part of America's society. I look at the post office or, the train system as another one of those pieces. We will be cut off from the rest of not only commerce, but our prescriptions and just communicating with our loved ones if we don't have our post offices being part of the government, and obviously it's a quasi-government system with our postal service. And, this is yet one other way, whether it's going to be the Park Service or the post office or our public schools. The Republicans always believe that big corporations can do it better. And we all know that that is not true for all. That may be true for the top, but it is not true for all. And that is where the Democratic Party clearly leans in and where we need to keep on communicating.
Michelle, can I just say from an entrepreneurial perspective, as part of our farming operations, we're expanding into something new where we're trying to help out Missouri farmers that raise crops like we do. So I'm not a row crop farmer and I don't do cow-calf operating anymore. I do specialty crops like mushrooms and that type of thing. But another thing that we're getting into is we're trying to do distribution for Missouri farmers. So we're going to get into the milling of Chinese chestnuts for gluten-free flour. We're going to get into white labeling elderberry products that are raised and manufactured here in the state of Missouri. When you look at it solely from an entrepreneurial perspective, the U.S. Post Office will come out to a rural area and for an inexpensive rate that a business in rural America can afford, they'll pick up those packages and they'll deliver them anywhere in the world we want to send them. And that's just not the case when you're talking about a UPS or a FedEx or, a DHL or somebody like that. So from that perspective, you would be eliminating one of the biggest proactive partners that rural entrepreneurs have when they're trying to start businesses and grow businesses.
Yeah. And my husband's a horticulturist, so same boat. And I think something I wrote this morning, or maybe it was yesterday morning, I lose track, is that if you can't put a price tag on it, if you can't do a cha-ching, you don't see the value in it. And I see this as just a common thread, is that we don't see the value. And through this, what's reflected in these policies, there's no value put to the quality of human life. Same thing with getting rid of the Digital Equity Act and so forth. Okay, as I'm looking at the clock, I want to make sure that we have, because this is, I have so many other questions I want to ask you, but one of the things that comes up so often, and we've done an episode specifically on disinformation and misinformation. I know that with each passing day, for our listeners, for all the folks you're talking to, disinformation and misinformation really feels like it's winning the race right now. It's coming at us hard, fast. And as soon as you hit one like whack-a-mole, another one comes up. But through town halls, you guys have been doing town halls, round tables like this. Communities can have their own candid conversations focused on policy versus the identity politics that have become so super popular. And they're designed to distract us. So for each of you, I would like for you to just give us your sage advice, your words of wisdom, how we're going to get past the rhetoric of misinformation. We've got some serious holes to dig ourselves out of it, just in terms of making sure people understand the facts and sort through it. So what are some ways that each of you can kind of share with our listeners how you sort through it all and understand how, no matter what your party affiliation is, you can advocate, and why it's important to advocate for policies, even if you don't think it impacts you today or maybe tomorrow?
I think we have to boldly and, frequently tell the truth and share facts, just relentlessly. Donald Trump lied big time to the American people to get elected. A lot of people believed what he said. He said he didn't even know what Project 2025 was, didn't even know those people who were running it. And then he went ahead and hired them and is in the process of implementing it every single day. And so that's what we're up against, and reminding people that are now having some buyer's remorse that they were lied to get their votes. And so we really have to stand up to do that. And then just in terms of disinformation that we see every single day, we've got to stand up and, again, tell that truth relentlessly, because that's what people are looking for right now, something that is authentic, that they can count on. And I think that's what the party needs to be doing right now in this moment. That's the moment that I think we're all needing to rise to right now.
Thank you. Chris. Yeah. Jane, go ahead.
I couldn't agree with you more, Chair. And, I'll give you a concrete example. So as we all know, our Democratic candidates got hit with supporting trans and drag shows and all this misinformation in the last election cycle. And, the mailers across the country, from Harris down to people running for school board, was Republicans care about you, Democrats care about they, them. And we honestly did not do hardly any pushback on that at all, because as Democrats, we of course support the LGBT community. We support civil and human rights. We didn't have a good message back. We just had a mayor's election in Omaha where we knocked out a 3-term incumbent. She was the longest serving Republican mayor. But in the middle of that campaign, they were doing that same tactic against the Democrat, John Ewing, sending out mailers, the whole bit. We decided to come together, and we used a little bit of humor and simple messaging in order to push back. We said, Gene is focused on potties. John is focused on fixing potholes. And that resonated, because people were like, you know what? We are tired of this talking about sports and bathrooms. What we really care about are these local issues. And in Omaha in particular, in a lot of cities, it's about the potholes that are adding $500 to $1,000 cost in people's pockets, because when they hit it, they get a flat tire. And that worked. And I think as Democrats, we have to be simplistic, right to the point, and use a little bit of humor in order to connect with voters.
Hey, Jade, the Omaha story is fascinating. I'm actually flying out to Nebraska for all of next week. I'll be in your neck of the woods.
I love that.
That's another conversation, another day. Okay, Chris, what say you? How do we connect with people? And, it's one thing to say we have to tell the truth. It's really hard to sort through. I mean, people,
Yeah.
you could be telling the truth and people say that they don't believe you. So what are some of the things that you're doing, the strategies that you're using to break through that?
Yeah, it's really hard to do, and the asymmetry throws you off often, and I'll get to this in a second. I'll come back to that point. Let me just quickly say two things, and I'll answer your question with 3 quick points.
Mm-hmm.
Jane mentioned the Tennessee Valley Authority, 100% spot on, and my PhD dissertation is actually on the Tennessee Valley Authority and how it transformed rural America, for generations and even now. So spot on what Jane said. Also want to just lift up the fact that we can applaud, even though it's nefarious, even though it's bad, even though they're bad actors, we can applaud the impressive machine that is the GOP communications machine. I mean, that it is super impressive and they are extremely effective. Now, to your point though, to the question, I don't think it is unbreakable. And I think there are 3 things that we have to do. Yes, we have to relentlessly, but with grace, tell the truth. And I specifically say with grace, because it's going to come to my 3rd point in a second. We can't bash folks and say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. Here are the facts, here are the facts, here are the facts. We do have to correct the record and say the truth. Now, we quickly say that on the asymmetry, when I ran, Sarah just had way more money. We have the truth on our side. We have the facts on our side. When we were able to get to folks and tell them, it was great. But she overpowered us because she just had more money and could reach more places, which builds to my second point for us. So relentlessly tell the truth with grace. Secondly, I think we have to build the infrastructure that doesn't always rely on massive amounts of money and TV time. The infrastructure at the local level that connects to the larger message that's coming out of the DNC and coming out of what Jane and all of her hard work. Like we have to head through Russ and Will and the work they're doing at the state level down to the ground. We have to build that messaging infrastructure, and specifically that it breaks beyond our normal DNC, our normal Democratic silos, if you would. And the last thing, which I think this is the most important thing, this is why I traveled to Harrison, Arkansas, which is known as one of the racist capitals of the country. This is why I went to small towns of 10 to 15 people that have said in no uncertain terms, I don't want to see a Dem, I don't want to see a Black person. Trust building. Because we have to build trust. I think it's the trust that we build that breaks through all the other noise. It breaks through, it allows us to then be able to walk across that bridge of trust with the facts, to walk across that bridge of trust with the reminders that, look, they lied to you, or that, look, it's okay that you made a decision to bring them in. Now let's move to the future. So having that trust bridge to me is critical. And you only get that by directly engaging with people, by building that relationship.
Yeah. They say relationships are built at the speed of trust. I really appreciate that comment. Will, we'll give you the last word on this one. What you how do you break through? I mean, you're a likable guy. I trust you. Maybe not everyone feels that way.
I'll tell you what I love about what Chris said. The reason I was smiling is because it's always fun to talk in front of people that agree with you, that give you a standing O, at the end of your speech. But I'm going down next month to talk to 300 Republican Texas cattlemen about these issues. And that's where I want to be. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to be in front of Democrats that believe the way I do as well. But I love it when I get a chance to do what Chris just talked about. And that is go stand in front of a group of people that disagree with me. And I think too, I agree with everything Jane and Russ and Chris said. We definitely need to talk about facts and lay these facts out in front of the American people. But I believe that we need to do 2 things. One, there is just a natural propensity on the part of rural people to want to be there for each other. And what I mean by that, and Jane and Russ and Chris can speak to this, if a farmer's got all of his round bales stacked out in the lot and some kid comes by and commits arson and burns them all, the very next thing that happened is in the next couple of days, other farmers are bringing hay over to replace it. When somebody's house burns down or a church gets vandalized, any of those kinds of things, the community shows up in force. When a basketball team qualifies for the state playoffs, the town turns out, they fund the trip, they show up to cheer. We need to take advantage of that, to Chris's point, with personal stories. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've been really successful at the Back 40 is because we try to start out every engagement with a personal story. Just one real quick. When we're talking about healthcare, when I was 12 years old, I grew up on a cattle farm and we were digging post holes out on our family farm. And I got my arm caught in the power takeoff on the tractor and it almost tore it off. And I laid out there on the ground because there were no regional healthcare facilities. There were no nearby ambulatory facilities. I laid on the ground for an hour and 50 minutes before an ambulance showed up. And then after they got there and they stabilized me, it was another 40 minutes to get to a hospital. If that same thing happened today, I would be at a regional healthcare center in 36 minutes. If you pose that story to rural America and you say, why would you want that to go away? Why would you want your grandkids to have to suffer the way I did as a 12-year-old kid? Nobody, unless they're just a horrible person, is going to disagree with that from a policy perspective. So I think, yes, point out the facts, but let's tell those personal stories and let's break through to people because it's a lot easier to just say you're lying if all you're talking about is facts. It's a lot tougher to look a guy in the eye that at 12 years old laid on the ground for an hour and 50 minutes waiting for an ambulance to show up and tell him he's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I'm almost less speechless because I've written stories about this exact same thing and waiting for life flight and so forth. And the one thing I'll add, and I wonder what you all think about this, I think we're not so good about asking questions. I think we want to share a lot of information. I think we want to push out data and all that. Stories are great, awesome, because what you just said, Will, just gave chills up my spine. I think we have to be better about asking questions. And understand, we talk about meeting people where they are. Let's understand what they know, what they think. And I say one of the talks I do is what people think, know, and feel. People don't shift their mindset until they feel something. And Will, what you just said makes us feel something. My goodness, to each of you, I wish we could, can we all just get on some kind of like email chain together and I can pick your brains?
I think we're on one, Michelle.
I think we are on one. Thank you, Jane, Will, Chris, Russ. I really do appreciate. I hope that all of our listeners, one comment I got was, why are you going to have a one-sided conversation? I personally don't believe this was a one-sided conversation. We covered a lot of territory, and we say often that these are not light subjects, but we do hope, because you've listened to this roundtable Candid Conversation, that you have been enlightened. So until the next time, we're going to see you all again in a new episode of The Rural Impact. We'll be right back with some closing messages. My thanks to the DNC for reaching out to the Rural Impact to host this roundtable. I'm very appreciative for the opportunity. A very special thanks to Jane, Chris, Russ, and Will for their time and especially for their candor. To my team behind the scenes, Bria Corsaro and Sarah Stubb, thank you as always for keeping the train moving out of the station. Always so appreciative. Now, before signing off, I do want to plant a few seeds. And the first is I want to remind you that this podcast is all about connecting the dots between policy and rural everything. And we have reached out to the Republican members of Congress, both current and past, to talk about these same subjects. So far, no takers, but that does not mean we will not continue to ask, because I do believe it's important to seek answers, clarity, and most of all, common ground. We could all use some of that more, a little bit more of that today, I think. Now, lastly, if you have yet to subscribe, you can do that wherever you get your podcast fix, including going to our website, which is theruralimpact.com. We make it really easy for you to sign up to receive our post-show newsletters. And if you are so inclined, we appreciate your donations. So thankful for all of you who have made donations, and we will be pleased to connect with you if you would like to explore ways to join us as a partner and expand your rural reach through one of our many, many partner opportunities. Until we're together again, this is Michelle Rathman again saying, please, I ask you to take really good care of yourself and to the best of your ability, those around you. We have much more in common. I really believe that than our differences, and being kind takes far less energy than being divided. We will see you soon.